Thanks, David. Just first, this fantastic conference today. Everyone is it's really interesting, and as you have pointed out, it's very very well run, and it's really nice to be part of a conference where everyone is got their tech game really up. So just moving quickly in this talk, I'm going to look at what latency is, because latency is a particular thing in the context of what we talk about it. How did it get here? How has latency been? What does it mean for us historically, which sort of informs how we work with latency now? I'm going to introduce the concept of flow, which is really the thing that we think about the most when we think about latency in our industry, music, and then how we can work with latency and how we can have achieve this concept of flow, regardless of how we're collaborating and how remote we are, and then some of the innovations we're going to see in the future. So about me, excuse me, I'm a musician, composer. Thank you. I was introduced from David. And since 2005, we've been the industry leader for remote recording solutions, particularly for the post-production industry, for ADR and review and approval. And every day, so we work with studios, actors, musicians, and orchestras and productions around the world. And so being remote is also a very important part of who I am, because I grew up in New Zealand, that island very far away in the South Pacific. And when the internet arrived, my interests and capabilities were immediately enhanced immeasurably. Just being able to find knowledge that was more recent than whatever books or magazines or TV shows had arrived and to our distant island, and then being able to share and generate new knowledge with others in real time. It was a real moment for me in my life. And so this experience continues to drive my search to find better ways of communicating and working over long distance. It is life-changing when you can work and play remotely over distance, as we've all learned these last 18 months. And there are huge opportunities yet to be discovered about how we can do that. But of course, distance brings challenges. And with that is latency. So let's start defining latency. Latency is the delay introduced when we send a signal from one point to another, whether this is over the internet or over a copper wire or through air or our neurons. Every time we send a signal, it doesn't arrive instantaneously. Latency is just something we're more aware of because of remote communication. It's becoming one of our primary means of communicating with each other. So latency has become an important topic, but it is widely misunderstood. So popular culture has been one of the largely misrepresented long-distance communications. And in the movies, latency somehow always communication is always somehow instantaneous. You'll get like, hi, this is Captain Alice in Galaxy M87. Can you tell us, Bob, in Sector 17, how's the weather in your part of the universe? And then somehow Bob gets to immediately write back, speak back, well, Alice, I'm just passing the majestic black cloud hole of Cygnus X1. Somehow they can have this conversation in real time, and we know that it's absolutely not possible over long distances. Though according to Star Trek, which is what this video is related to, this conversation would happen over a subspace network that transmits data at 183,000 times the speed of light, but that's science fiction. So the question I get particularly a lot from musicians is, when are you going to get rid of latency? Well, never, because they're just talking about network latency for a start. So we've been adjusting for other latencies as humans since we've evolved. We've been experiencing and living with latency a long time, not just since telecommunications. We experience natural propagation latencies all the time. The speed of sound travels at a fairly slow rate through the air, and how far it travels depends on the decibel level. The loudest sound ever registered by humans was the 1883 Krakatoa volcano explosion. It was 172 decibels and was heard up to 5,000 kilometers away. That took 4 hours to travel, 5,000 kilometers. And you can see from this graph that that sound traveled halfway around the world, across Australia, the Indian Ocean, to southern China. And isochronic distances, or being distanced from each other according to time, have, however, gotten much shorter than 5 hours to travel a sound. But for millennia, travel time was measured not in milliseconds like we do today, but in hours or days. So, for example, a letter from London to Sydney 100 years ago, as you can see in this map, would take about a month to arrive. Well, I assume that's assuming there's no pirates. And even the optical telegraph or the semaphore signals that were used in the 1700s, they could only travel so quickly. First being optical, had to make sure we had good weather. And at best, you could get a message from London to Portsmouth, they reckon, around 15 minutes. And then magic happens with electricity. Magic. In the 1800s, we could send messages over great distances using methods that slowly became automated, from telegraphs to telegraph machines to computers. And today we have fiber optic, we have satellite communications. Signals don't even need to traverse the world. They can bounce up into the ceilings and to the heavens and back down again. And of course, these transmission delays we're experiencing now are really reaching the limits of physics. Still, these are great distances. Perhaps not the stellar different distances between galaxy M87 and the Cygnus black hole, but still great distances nonetheless. The speed of light has limits. This animation is really great for showing us visually the speed of light. So when data travels out of light, it's not real time, it's near real time. So here you could see going around the Earth, you could see it's about 1.5 seconds to the moon and back. And this is even slowed down to Mars. So Mars on a good day would be even slower than this. This is slowed down even more. You would not be able to watch with the naked eye the speed of light, a photon traveling between the sun and the Earth. So when data travels over light, it's not real time, it is what we would call near real time. And regardless, today, most of our data travels over cables, and we don't even have lines going directly from one location to another. Here's a map of undersea cables. We've got routing and switching to get from one cable to another increases latency even further. So remote communication isn't just delayed because of network latency. There's also a lot of other paths that a signal needs to follow to reach us, and some we've adapted for each other. So we don't really experiencing them. They're already kind of native, like biological latency, which is the time it takes for audio to be processed from the physical air, from air pressure to mechanical to electrical. We've evolved to accommodate for many of these physical latencies. We can stand a few meters apart and have a conversation just fine as if we're right next to each other. Our brains have evolved to accommodate for this. We don't notice those latencies, but there is latency. As well as the physical and biological latency. Once the audio signal gets past to the auditory context, there is neurological latency, where the processing speed depends on the person's brain. And our brains are experts at processing latency because it's had a lot of information about our environment for a long time. For example, we know how to process when the same sound arrives a little bit later in one ear or the other. We use that latency for echo locating direction. Or if sounds are heard in the same direction, in the same position, we might experience those sounds as being the same. And that's how we understand timbre, for example, with an orchestra. It's how we blend sounds when they have the same kind of attack. But shift those attacks a little bit, and then a little bit out of sync, and suddenly we hear them as rhythms, we hear them as melodies. And so on top of all of these biological and neurological latencies, there's also cognitive and emotional latency. So there's a time it takes for us to cognitively form and understand the response to stimuli. So this can be many more milliseconds higher than network or electrical or physical latency. And still, there's another larger contributor to latency, and that is our equipment, our hardware and software. Each transformation needs time. Professional equipment can have latencies down to the samples, but consumer software, browsers, these can be up to 30 milliseconds. So we've got compression algorithms and analog to digital converters, which are time hungry. A lot of the consumer equipment, of course, USB devices, they will take up just, they'll add a lot more processing. And so you add in plugins and loudness filters and all of this latency can end up being a lot more than the network latency, depending on how far away you are from each other. So latencies are found everywhere. Every time a signal is transferred or transmitted or transformed or subject to transfer constraints or it needs processing, there's latency. Well, we already accommodate natively to so many kinds of latencies already, biological, neurological, cognitive. In the last centuries, we've added these extra latencies at such a rapid rate that naturally it's all a little bit disconcerting for our brains. While we accommodate natively for so many kinds of latencies, while we accommodate for these latencies, we're needing to also think about stability. So there's one thing which is latency being stable, but the more disruptive is the instability to latencies we already have. This is where jitter comes in. So jitter being a byproduct of packet switch networks, which is what the public internet is built on. Dedicated circuit switch networks like ISDN were mostly immune to packet loss, which is why we could have such low latencies with ISDN connections. We didn't need a jitter buffer. And packet switch networks, however, favor bandwidth and automatic healing over reliable delivery. If you remember that map of all those cables, all the switching and routing interrupts the speeds of transmission. One packet may go over one route, one may take another route, and these will take different times, or a line gets cut, or there's a sudden surge on a connection due to a local event. This happens all the time, every day. And while our packet networks are incredibly resilient, the timing is affected. So the packet switched internet is not guaranteed to get your data delivered on time or in order, much like when you order a few things online, depending on the circumstances. Some packages may arrive on time, some late, or some not at all. So jitter interrupts the stability of latency, and that means we need a jitter buffer. So jitter itself being the measure of the instability, and we need a jitter buffer. In networks, there's a long distance travel. On Wi-Fi networks, is even worse. Wi-Fi adds a lot of jitter, more prone to congestion than internet, or maybe we're sharing a network with our families who might be on the Xbox the same time as you want to be doing an HD video conference. We need a much longer jitter buffer to accommodate for all of this extra latency on the network, all of the extra information that's trying to get through the network at once. You have too long of a jitter buffer, now we've got too long latency. But you have too little jitter buffer, you have packet loss. It's a delicate balance. So all these latencies and instabilities lead to the popular perception that working and playing remotely is so disruptive that we hear you can't play music together over the internet. Or we have certain types of interactions that are just really hard to do, like interviews with lots of people, with more than one or two people. But why exactly? Why do we have this perception? So it's because we evolved to communicate at short latencies. It's because we evolved for our brains to not have these signals delayed so much by the transmission, by transformation. We evolved to have conversations and play music at low latency, where social and cultural rhythms expect that low latency, and they also expect a reliable delivery. Think of when you're trying to have a conversation with someone in the strong wind or rain. It's the same kind of thing. You can't really hear each other and it gets disrupted, and it's a really awkward, difficult conversation. That's kind of the same thing that's happening here over the internet when we have too much latency, too much jitter. What it does is it interrupts flow. The Hungarian psychologist Csikszentmihalyi spent his lifetime discovering what made people happy, and his major contribution to the field of psychology, which feels really fantastically to the idea of music, the idea of conversation, the idea of when you're enjoying yourself, is the concept of flow, the phenomenon where we experience time passing effortlessly, where everything just works, where there's no anxiety. And flow can happen spontaneously, or we can create it. We can create the conditions where flow might happen. For example, we can find ourselves wanting to be put into that music state that we can play. We can put on the music. We can start playing the music that we know gets us into flow. We can sit down with our friends knowing we're going to have a great conversation, that nothing's going to interrupt us. We can make this flow happen. Flow means everything's in sync, that there's no interruption, that rhythms can be anticipated, that there's very little cognitive effort required for each step, that it's reliable, that it's stable, that we're not getting too much information lost. And it's what children experience when they're playing. It's what we experience when we're enjoying ourselves. The flow is closely related to control and relaxation. It's easily disrupted by anxiety and worry and boredom. And this is what packet loss and low quality communications and high latencies create: anxiety. The flow is about being in tune with each other, with the system we're interacting with. It's about finding a rhythm and being able to keep that rhythm going. It's as much as a physical experience as it is a mental one. The latency, the new kinds of communications latencies that we're experiencing, they very easily disrupt the experience of flow that we've evolved as humans and developed in our cultures for millennia. So latency means that we cannot rely on our evolved responses. This is where it gets interesting, because culture, or how we express ourselves, is extremely adapting, extremely accepting of change. It's very, very quick to evolve. There are a number of approaches. So when we are open to adapting our behavior, and broadcast, for example, think how quickly we adapted to long distance conversations. We've got really good at this. We make space for each other. We wait until someone's finished speaking. This is performance behavior. We adjust quickly according to the conditions, and it gets easier with practice. And it's easier seeing other people do it well. We learn from each other. We adjust because communicating is such a crucial part of being human together. It's more important for us to adapt and communicate than just to give up and say, I can't do it. And learning new performance behavior just means learning new rhythms. So I've worked with a number of musicians the last years in researching how we can play together, get added or uncertain latency. And it's just like learning a new instrument. We listen, we adapt to these new constraints. We adapt our phrase lengths or intuitively modify how phrases connect and layer with each other. We get new syncopations, we learn new kinds of rhythms. We retune instinctively. So while latency cannot be reduced to much lower levels than our dedicated equipment audio provides, certain interactions that rely on low latency may never be able to be undertaken remotely. But we can learn new forms of communication and we can develop new forms of art. That's not to say that we need to live with unnecessarily high latencies, at least within certain distances, because eventually jitter will be reduced. High speed internet will have enough bandwidth for everybody, it will cover the earth, and there'll be no need for a jitter buffer ever again. I look forward to that day. Hemispheres and all our devices will be super low latency, and even packet loss will be solved with really increasing sophistication and speed of algorithms, and entire words and sentences could be reconstructed based on missing context, based on sufficient context. And there are non-technical solutions. We have cultural, musical, performance solutions. Sociologist Professor Caroline Navion reminds us that this strives of survival and well-being makes us take hurdles that we thought we never would. We want to communicate. It's part of being human. And in our speech and in our communications, we are constantly informing each other where we are with the aid of markers and breadcrumbs and punctuation. This is vital information that keeps us in sync, that maintains context. When communicating remotely, this vital information can be also a visual guide or information embedded in our music, or a nod that we might do with our head to say we're going to start, or we're going to change bars, or now we're arriving at Te Kapo. These are flags that tell us when and where we are. We do them naturally. It's part of how we learn to communicate with each other. So we intuitively seek out how to be and how to feel and how to be responsive with each other. Our challenge is to adapt to and with technology, to make new technology, to adapt to technology, for it to be a give and take, to be playful with it, so we can easily get into the zone of flow. So that communication, so that music, so play, so theatre, everything flows freely. Our challenge is to adapt and invent to new creative solutions, along with technical ones. I strongly believe there are many developments yet to come with technology and culture. We've really only just started to scratch the surface of how we can gather together and work together and be entertained together. I'll end with a short anecdote. My nephews in New Zealand, when they were young, a few years back, my brother would set up the iPad for them on the breakfast table. I would be having dinner here in Europe. And after breakfast, they would take the iPad with them physically. So pick it up and we'd go and play. They'd show me the chickens and run around outside and go back inside and show me the Lego. They'd, hide me under a blanket and they'd laugh, ha, 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 you can't see me, Rebekah. They're playing because their play, it didn't need me to be there. It just needed me to be responsive with them. And I really believe that this means there's a rich future of hybrid and remote experience where play happens regardless of the medium. So thank you so much.